Good evening, everybody. Is this microphone working? Am I being heard in suitably stentorian and nigh godlike tones? I'll take that as a yes. We're here tonight, obviously, to discuss James Brabazon and his book, My Friend the Mercenary and Matters Arising. It's very probable that all of you here have a very good idea of who James is and what he's done, but nonetheless, a recap. And as depressing as it is for any fellow journalist to have to précis James's career and accomplishments, here is a summary. He is mostly a filmmaker and cameraman, in which capacity he has won 2 Rory Peck Awards, the IDA Courage Under Fire Award, the IDFA Joris Ivans Competition Special Jury Award, though I think he made that one up, and been
spotted that so far.
and been nominated for 2 BAFTAs and 2 Emmys. His films have been shown by the BBC, Channel 4, CNN and Discovery, among others, and he has also written, and generally annoyingly well, for The Observer, The Independent, The Guardian and Arena. His first book, My Friend the Mercenary, recalls his tangential involvement in what has since become known in some circles as the Wonga coup, the 2004 plot for a coup d'etat in the oil-soaked West African nation of Equatorial Guinea, in which a plane load of middle-aged, largely white, semi-retired South African mercenaries would fly into Malabo and overthrow the local tyrant, having stopped en route to pick up guns in Harare, of all places. What could possibly go wrong? When it did go wrong, it was in the news quite a lot, and around that time I remember having dinner with James, and I mentioned this story, which had been in the news quite a lot, and he rather guiltily admitted that he might know something about this story, which in the early stages of the reporting was being made to sound like kind of regime change as scripted by Gilbert and Sullivan, or conceivably Laurel and Hardy. James mentioned that he did have some sort of inside track on this story, which he then proceeded to inform me of, while my eyes opened, my eyebrows lifted and my jaw dropped to the extent that by the time the bill arrived my face was about the size of a satellite dish. But I did go home that evening knowing that one day it would make an absolutely excellent book, and it has. Now, what's important is that the book is about much more than the failed coup d'etat. The story that unfolds in My Friend the Mercenary is so bizarre and belief-beggaring that it would make a gripping read, even if it had been churned out by the most mediocre hack. But James manages to make it much, much more than that, as well as an absolutely astonishing, couldn't-make-it-up, ripping boys' own adventure yarn. It is also a very thoughtful and really quite bracingly and mercilessly honest rumination on morality and friendship, which uses the crucible of war and its attendant hostility and camaraderie to boil down 2 of the immortal mysteries, which are what make people hate each other and what causes people to love each other. Now, I think at this point we're going to see a film, or a short excerpt of a film. Is that right?
Yes, hello. We're going to see
James Brabazon, sorry, incidentally.
Thank you. It's I'm going to see the first. This is a book-related talk, but you know, film's in the blood a bit. So I thought we'd see the first few minutes of a documentary that I made in 2005 about my relationship with Nick du Toit, one of the military architects of the Equatorial Guinea coup, and for various reasons it was an extremely difficult film to make and not a terribly successful one. But the first few minutes of this do give something of sort of the nature of the context of our relationship, and I thought we could then crack on with Andrew's merciless grilling of me. I've done this to him once, by the way, so this is a kind of revenge, a revenge drama. Yes. Okay, let's do it. can't see anything, so tell me.
I'm a freelance journalist filming a brutal civil war in Liberia. In front of me is my bodyguard, Nick du Toit.
Stay on the side.
Ex-South African Special Forces, arms dealer, sometime mercenary. A gun for hire.
Thanks a lot for your review. We'll see you in a few days' time.
That's me in the thick of it.
The number of times he saved my life by doing one thing or another, I can't even keep count of. And he put himself directly in the firing line.
I'd only known Nick a few months, but our experience brought us close together.
I wouldn't be here now. I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for Nick. It's that simple. Nick and I had hours and hours and hours to talk to one another, to talk about our families, our friends, our hopes, our fears. And he saved my life. Once you've been in a situation where you owe your very existence to someone, you see that person for what they are to you, and what other people might think of Nick, and what other people might think of what he did or was trying to do. That's not something you can calculate into the equation.
Just a week back from Liberia, I got a strange call.
And on that bombshell, I think we were going to start with a brief reading from my friend the Mercenary. And this is from the introduction to the book, yes?
It will be brief. One of the reasons, by the way, I wanted just to show that clip as well is that I spent quite a lot of time talking about Nick, but unless you've seen the film or looked at the plates in the book, very few people know what he actually sort of looks like, and I think it's just quite nice to have an image of this person that a lot's been said and written about. It's been a very brief reading. You have to forgive me, I don't do a lot of public reading, and I'm nervous of audiences this large, working mainly for Channel 4. In the last cell, a man is screaming on the floor. His hands have been cuffed tightly behind his back. His legs have been pinned at the ankles with shackles, which have been hammered shut by the soldiers. Skin and muscles split as metal bites down to bone. Boots stamp on his feet, ripping out toenails. The prisoner's name is Nick du Toit. He is South Africa's most notorious mercenary and one of my best friends. Nick confessed before this torture began, in public, at gunpoint, in accurate, extensive detail, a day after he was seized. He no longer knows nor cares what he confesses to. His story shifts to fit the fantasies of his jailers, but it is a desperate, pointless game. In this ramshackle collection of wooden huts and concrete cells, fenced off from the sea and the world beyond by rolls of barbed wire, Nick's tormentors are not seeking the truth, they want revenge. Nick is dragged up from the stone floor and forced to kneel. The commander enters the cell and puts a pistol to his head. He has come to execute him, but the gun is empty. Laughing, the guards knock him unconscious with their rifle butts. The same ritual is repeated over and over again. Nick is left to the mercy of the rats in his tiny 5x7 cell. His hands and feet remain chained. Like an animal, he eats scraps of food from the floor, where he must also sleep and defecate. There is no daylight. He is kept in pitch darkness and beaten daily. And then the septicemia sets in. Pus oozes from his open wounds, sustaining the cockroaches that feast on his sores. By the time he is dragged outside, his eyes have sealed shut. The soldiers immerse his head in freezing water and then rip the scabs from his eyes. This is how Nick begins his 34-year sentence in Black Beach Prison, Africa's most notorious jail. He was arrested on the 8th of March 2004, along with 15 other men, as he tried to overthrow the government of Equatorial Guinea, a tiny West African country fabulously rich in oil. but there is just one person missing from the scene. What Nick doesn't see when he opens his eyes that day is me. Had all gone according to plan, I could have been lying next to him. I was supposed to film the coup.
And that's the introduction to the book, which I guess is what really sets out the importance of this story to you, that could very easily have been you, but for a quirk of fate, as it were. What was it that stopped you from being there?
What stopped me from being there, well, was that my grandfather died at exactly the time that the coup was being launched. In fact, as a child, I was partly raised by my grandfathers and by my grandparents, and my mother's father particularly was a sort of very strong father figure for me, and had brought me up. And so he wasn't sort of a remote elderly figure with whom I didn't have much contact. He was, you know, an incredibly present person in my life at that time, and a very important person, and much of an inspiration of why I went into to Liberia in the first place. And he'd been very seriously ill with cancer. I've been on, at this point, 48-hour standby to deploy for the coup, to film it. I emailed Nick and told him that I, was going to be off radar for a while. My grandfather died. I organised the funeral. I switched my phone back on, switched the radio back on, came back to my apartment in London, down from the family house in Kent, and almost the first thing that came onto the news was a plane load of mercenaries had been seized in Harare, and everything unfolded from there. And Nick had been arrested, and I was still in the UK.
I mean, the first question I had written down tonight, which I'm pretty sure was the first question I asked you that dinner I mentioned earlier when you first sort of explained to me your sort of knowledge of what had gone on. And especially given the consequences of it, as you outlined in that introduction, the question, when the plan was first put to you in that first meeting with Nick du Toit and Simon Mann at a later date, it's how was your first response not, are you people out of your minds?
Yeah. You see, with hindsight, that does seem somewhat of a good conclusion to arrive at. I mean, I'll be honest with you, there's a very great deal of this which is simply context. And the first point that the coup was put to me was in a bar in Conakry, the capital of the Republic of Guinea in West Africa. And I was sitting with Nick on the terrace of this sort of rundown hotel, which is our favourite bar, getting soaks on local beers, which are fortified with formaldehyde. Strangely but truly, and getting very, well, I think drunk's the actual correct word. We were waiting to go back to the front line in Liberia. This was May 2003. It's very early, right at the very genesis of the operation. Nick himself had known about the operation for probably not more than 10 days. And we'd already made 2 trips into rebel-held Liberia together. I'd been filming documentary film projects with the rebels, the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, who were...
You have to wonder what names they turned down, don't you?
Or the Lurd, as they were known, or I can't believe it's not Lurd, as Nick and I would say. And we'd spent 2 long filming trips with the Lurd already, which had been, and we might come on to this in a bit, which had been exceptionally difficult filming assignments. There's a little bit of a clip from the first one of them. I think at one point we were pretty much continuously in combat for 28 days. And they were very, very long, physically degrading trips. So by the time I was sitting with Nick in a bar in West Africa, waiting to go back again to the front line, this time outside of Monrovia, the idea that we sort of go from documenting this final onslaught against the capital and then we sort of move on somewhere else and I'd film kind of regime change somewhere else, it didn't strike me as absurd or complicated as it probably should have done. And it's one of the sort of defining factors about being a freelance journalist, which is a point worth making at the Frontline Club, I suppose, is that you know, you're pretty much as good as your last gig. And I had absolutely exclusive access to the Liberian Civil War. I was the only filmmaker operating on the rebel side at all, and which was great. You know, sort of you know, the war had launched my career, and I was thinking, well, you know, within the next couple of weeks, this war will be finished, and then what am I going to do next? And here's a man who saved my life, who I'm absolutely indebted to in many respects, has just offered me a phenomenal gig. There is almost no filmed footage of mercenary-led operations in Africa at all. And he said, you know, would you like to come along and film it? So, you know.
So, I mean, did it strike you at the time as actually plausible? Did you think this could work? They could actually do this?
After 5 pints of formaldehyde beer, I'd tell you my dad was Bob Hope, and believe it. The plan as originally conceived, it's very important to kind of understand this, the plan that was originally conceived was absolutely not the astonishing catalogue of buffoonery that was put into operation in March 2004. The original operation, as conceived, was a classic seaborne landing. Would use dinghies launched from a mother ship. They would be a mixture of white mercenary officers, former black South African and Angolan soldiers that either fought in 3-2 Battalion or in 5 Recce, which is the Special Forces group that Nick commanded in the apartheid-era army, and also a large number of Liberian rebels as sort of backup. I mean, that actually did give me pause for concern, because having spent a very great deal of time standing next to them firing a large number of different kinds of automatic weapon, I could see exactly where the rounds usually ended up, and it was normally not on target. So that was a bit worrying. But actually, as a sort of operation went, logistically it was pretty straightforward. The island, you know, Bioko, which is the main island bit of Equatorial Guinea, was incredibly lightly defended. And as far as military operations go, it was fairly. I mean, it was plausible. It remained plausible for a long time, but the way in which it evolved meant that by the time the operation was actually launched, a very large number of people who were instrumental to the planning and success of the operation worked for South African intelligence. So the plot was so comprehensively infiltrated by the time that it was launched that the actual people facilitating the entire operation actually worked for the South African government. So had it gone ahead immediately, there was a chance of something occurring. We can go into more detail on what if you like, but when it finally happened, it was so much a foregone conclusion of failure that it was really only a mixture of extreme avarice and frankly stupidity that allowed it to go ahead at all.
Which brings us to where Nick ended up, which is the section you describe in that reading. And I was wondering, at that point, even after the whole thing had gone terribly, terribly wrong, and it struck me as significant that that's where you start the book, was there still an extent to which you either felt like you should have been there or that you wished that you had been there, even after it had gone wrong?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, yeah. Totally, yeah.
Why was that? Just out of thinking there should be somebody there to share whatever he was going through, or to think that you could have done something about it, or...?
It's a kind of number of quite complex, well, actually some very straightforward emotions and some more complex ones. I think firstly, I mean, obviously, I didn't know the conditions that Nick would be held in and what would happen to the people who are arrested in Equatorial Guinea.
You could imagine that they were going to be rugged, though.
Well, I mean, we expected them to be shot.
Yeah.
Put out of hand immediately, and actually, subsequently, I mean, that's what Nick expected to happen as well, and I think it got quite close to that at one point. I mean, it was much later that I really understood exactly what had happened to Nick. It was actually only when he was released finally in exactly a year ago that I really kind of fully understood what had gone on. But I felt, yeah, very much in the sense of, you know, Nick had been, when I'd most needed him, he had been there and had pulled me out of it. And at that point, in the most sort of challenging bits of the time we worked together, Nick wasn't being paid. The production company that I went to Liberia with in the first place, the first trip, folded effectively while I was there. So, which sort of put me in the rather sort of invidious position of having to explain to Nick, who at that point I really didn't know very well, 3 weeks into this trip, that, and by the way, he was sort of in full reconnaissance battle dress at this point with about 300 rounds of AK strapped to his chest and his favourite Kalashnikov over his knees, and to explain to him that in fact he wasn't going to get paid, which is it's a pretty tough proposition for a mercenary to accept, given the nature of the work. And surprisingly, I'm still here, and Nick thought it was actually quite amusing, and realised, I mean, I didn't have a film at that point. My crew, I brought in a sound man and a cameraman who'd, I'll be gracious. Their contract was up and they left. As they left, the cameraman handed me a small mini DV camera, a box of 20 tapes, a couple of batteries, a charger, and said, there you go, good luck. I'd never shot any television pictures at that point. I was a stills photographer and a producer. And as he just got to the edge of the jungle with his rebel support team, you know, leading him back to civilization, and turned around and said, oh, and produced a little white booklet from his pocket and said, you might find that useful, was the instruction manual for the camera. So Nick and I figured out how to use the camera together, and then I shot the film, and instead of being there for 3 weeks, we were there for 3 months. Unpaid. The fact that he'd been arrested and I wasn't there was, you know, it was painful professionally because I wanted to be on the ground seeing it unfold. It was painful on a personal friendship level because I wanted to be with him. And also, there's a very pervasive sense, I feel, when it's certainly not a unique feeling. I mean, I'm sure a large number of people here have been in conflict situations. If you are the person that survives, there is this sort of a kind of very palpable sense of guilt at times. And Nick and I really survived something in Liberia. I mean, almost everybody else was killed, often around us. And I felt a long time afterwards thinking, well, why was that? Why did we get out of that and all those other people didn't? And I thought that Nick was not going to get out of it. At that point, I was very confused, and I was very embarrassed, actually, at my own survival or prospect of it. Okay.
Well, the bit you mentioned there, which it comes across in the book, I guess, as the beginning of a sort of realisation that the friendship with Nick is more than professional, is that moment when you have to explain to this monumentally armed, ruthless South African mercenary that you've marooned him in the middle of a West African bush rumble and you can't actually pay him, and he agrees to stay. And you write, I think, you're sort of very upfront in the book about your sort of lingering moral qualms about Nick's past. Nick was, of course, a special forces officer for serving serving a South African regime universally and really quite rightly regarded as just rank evil. And the line you use yourself is that his past career is rather closer to Waffen SS than SS, SAS rather. Do you think you and Nick would have been friends under other circumstances if you just met him socially?
Well, so I think there's a couple of things there. When I met Nick in the first place, I didn't really know a very great deal about his background. I mean, I was introduced to Nick on the basis that I had been given the inside track on this war happening in northern Liberia by another South African mercenary who had introduced me had introduced me to US intelligence officers who were effectively running the rebels. And that was how I got access to them in the first place. But the first mercenary, Mercenary 1, Cobus, had said, look, there's no way you're going to be able to do this alone. You need a bodyguard. You need someone that can run an evacuation for you, that has good medical skills, that can effectively create a space around you to give you enough room to film without constantly having to manage your own security. So that seemed like a straightforwardly excellent idea to me. And when I met Cobus and Nick together, I was introduced to Nick, and Nick, I was expecting sort of like the front. Well, actually, somebody looks a bit like Cobus, to be honest, like the front cover of an Andy McNab novel. Some sort of roughy-tufty, muscle-bound chap. And Nick is incredibly mild-mannered, very smartly dressed, with nicely kind of pressed chinos with a razor-sharp crease down the front, and a sort of short-sleeve blue and white check shirt with a top pocket with a row of pens and a notepad, and a neatly cut side-parted hair and a very carefully trimmed boa moustache. And I mean, he really looked like he was going to try and sell me life insurance and not save my life. I mean, it was really, he looked like an estate agent. It was extraordinary. During the conversation, it came out not only had he been Cobus's commanding officer in executive outcomes in Sierra Leone in the mid-90s, which is a private army which was deployed into West Africa to defeat the RUF rebels. It's a simplified nutshell. And consequently was somewhat well qualified for the job of operating in that area. But also he'd been a lieutenant colonel, actually retired as a full colonel, and had been the founding father of Five Recce, one of the founding fathers of Five Recce, which was a South African Special Forces unit which specialised in mainly in pseudo operations, which were extremely controversial operations, which were pioneered originally by the British in Malaysia, then the Selous Scouts in Rhodesia. Essentially, these were operators. It was very unusual in the South African army because most of Five Recce were black troops, so black South Africans and black Angolans, mainly South Africans, who would pose as people that Nick referred to as terrorists, and who I've been brought up to call freedom fighters, and would lure other terrorists / freedom fighters basically to their deaths. I mean, it was a very brutal war. But also Nick had been deployed on large special forces deployments right through the Angolan War, through Mozambique, but I didn't really know any of this at the time.
Right.
It was when we were in Liberia and my crew had gone, and I was. We are being filmed. It is live after all, and off they fucked. I found myself with Nick thinking, well, I don't actually know who you are particularly, and Nick got very ill almost immediately. He got incredibly bad dysentery, and to the point we had no drugs, medicine at all, because it had all gone down the river, this huge river we'd crossed on the way. We'd lost it all. And I thought he'd died. I mean, really was convinced he was dead. And that sort of slight, I mean, now comedy, then absolutely not comedy moment of staring at him looking for signs of life, thinking, God, he actually is dead. And then he came back to life, and when he sort of, then he really came back to life. And as he was recovering, I was coming down with it, and as I was sort of slipping into this kind of, you know, extraordinary, semi kind of typhoid-like delirium, he said, you know, God, I haven't been this ill since I was I was on operations in Zimbabwe in 1985. I was like, God, really? That's amazing. Hang on a minute. Zimbabwe had been independent for 5 years by then. What were you doing? He said, oh, we were blowing up a safe house. And that was it. I was gone. Nick literally brought me back to life. He sourced probably the only antibiotics in northern Liberia. And without ruining anyone's dinner, I was not really capable of moving by myself, and yet still needed to go to the latrine a dozen times an hour. So Nick would, you know, literally, I mean, it got to the point where, you know, I mean, Nick would assist in that endeavour and clean up the consequences. So I mean, there comes a point at which, to sort of boil it down, if you've been held up by your wrists by another man while you take a shit in a ditch, you're either mates or you're not. And by the time I'd sort of come to, Nick and I were mates, and hey presto, I was getting a potted history of you know, South African reconnaissance commando operations across the subcontinent from 1975 to 1994. And it was a very...
I mean, it's an extreme example, and I think that one of the things that rings very true about the book is that, and again, there will be a lot of people here tonight who know what this is like. If you've worked as a journalist or in any other capacity in a, you know, a screwed up or difficult environment, you're often thrown into a position where you're utterly reliant on people you barely know, have, you know, maybe met a matter of hours previously, and yet have to find a way to get on with. And they may be people that whom back in London you would, and indeed some cases will, actually want to hit with a blunt implement.
Or marry.
or indeed marry. Yeah. But it's... what is it? I mean, do you think it's... do you think there's an extent to which you have to make friends with somebody in a situation like that, or your life becomes unbearable, and that's what makes the friendship stick?
Well, I would say that working in conflict, which is not about being a journalist, it's about being in conflict generally, as you well know yourself. It's basically a pressure cooker.
Yes.
And it compresses, you know, relationships or friendships that might have taken years to develop and would have done so in perhaps a very different way, develop extremely quickly.
It does the same to animosities as well, of course.
It does, yeah. I mean, you know, without obviously ever naming any names, every now and again you end up in a very difficult situation abroad with someone that you're working with that you might not ordinarily choose to socialise with in London, say.
Yeah.
And you're right at that point. What goes through your mind is sort of thinking of various ways in which you could dispose of them without being arrested. And the opposite's true, you know. And you know, to answer, this is a very bloody long answer to a very simple question. Would Nick and I have become friends outside of this? Here's the truth. Actually, it's kind of quite easy to get hung up on the fact that, you know, what's a journalist doing becoming friends with an apartheid-era assassin? Actually, apartheid-era assassins aren't that well known for their love of the liberal media.
There is that.
So I don't know how Nick and I would have met otherwise. He's a very private man.
Yeah.
A very private. I mean, Cobus wasn't. He was kind of, you know, out. He was still living in Sierra Leone, which tells you a lot about the Sierra Leoneans' relationship to the mercenaries who saved their ass. And you know, he was living the dream, you know. But Nick was, like I say, he was totally and absolutely incognito. You would, you know,
I mean, everything you said is an illustration of, and it is one of the most interesting things about travelling in any sort of conflict zone, is that you do see people at their best and you see them at their worst. And you write in the book, or at least you've written elsewhere, that you don't think that there are good and evil people, that you just think people do good things and they do evil things. And I mean, do you actually think that, do you think that everybody's capable of both? I guess if you place at one extremity, you know, saving the life of a stranger, and at the other extremity taking the life of a stranger, do you think that both those things are in everybody?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, without this sort of becoming a sort of theological ramble, and just keeping it as a ramble, I'm extremely reluctant to subscribe to the idea that there are good and evil people. I think there are people, and people do good and bad things.
Okay.
And I think that the one of the sort of more challenging aspects of the job that we do, and anyone working conflict, is a lot of the people. I mean, Nick is sort of one example, but the people that I was filming in Liberia, the rebels, the rebel commanders were. I mean, they were keeping me alive. These guys were feeding me. They would share the last of their cigarettes with me. They'd give me the last of their rice ration. We'd sit around and talk about our, talk about our relationship problems. How's your girlfriend doing these days? Well, you know, and we just talked like we were, these were rebel commanders, and then the next morning, they'd shoot a couple of prisoners, and I'd film it. And then they might behead someone, you'd film that, and then they say, oh, actually, have you got any smokes left? Because I think I've had the last one. Okay, there's one for you. And it was just sort of, on the one hand, you could see these were people doing good things, and on the other hand, these were people committing unspeakable atrocities. And there was one occasion I filmed a group of rebels tortured a government soldier to death, and then disemboweled him and partly ate him. And what I think disturbed me the most about that episode was once you remove the trappings of war from those young men, once you get rid of the sweat and the braids and the rifle and the juju charms and all the bollocks that young men surround themselves with in war, once you strip all that crap away, there's much more that I have in common, that we have in common with those people, than we have that's different to them. And I'm very reluctant. It creates difficulties when you start talking, when the legal process and the prosecution of war crimes and what constitutes a crime in war, if war itself is not a crime. Yeah, it's and those themes are at the centre. I mean, anyone working in war, I think those are the themes that you have to struggle with.
Were you able to take that human view of them at the time, or did that come later? Because I was wondering...
it came very much at the time.
Because writing anything down in retrospect is often a kind of useful way of either making sense to yourself or of what happened, or at least lying satisfactorily to yourself about what happened. But the actual process of writing the book, did that teach you anything that you hadn't already previously thought of about what you'd experienced?
Yeah, I did actually, yeah. I mean, a lot of things. When one of the rebel commanders was killed, and I felt genuinely sad when he was killed. I mean, Deku was, by anybody's standard, a murderer. I mean, certainly. But I was sad when he died. And part of that was selfish, because he was one of the best commanders and most likely to be keeping me in one piece. But also because, we'd walked, 300 miles together through the jungle. And when I was writing about it, I was kind of finally forced to really look at those relationships properly.
Yeah.
And with Nick as well, it's like he was incarcerated for he was released halfway through me writing this book, and from the very outset of knowing Nick up until writing this book, in one way or another, I'd lied about my friendship and my relationship with him. and I'd lied about the content of what had gone on between us, partly to protect him, partly to protect myself, partly because the process of making that film, there were things that my colleagues or that commissioning editors or that people, other right-minded, upstanding members of society just didn't want to hear, or it was very apparently compromising to have friends like Nick. And when I started writing this, I thought, I am absolutely going to tell the truth as I see it, and that there will be no more hiding behind, oh, well, I can't do this because you might get in trouble. It's like, actually, this is it. I'm going to write it as it is, and the process of doing that, one that came out of it, I mean, it's one thing to say that someone's your friend.
Yeah.
It's another to spend a year analysing it and writing it down in minute detail.
Yeah.
And I came out of this process knowing, not just believing or thinking, but knowing that he is one of the best friends one could ever have.
Did the same process, I guess, of revisiting in detail from the safety of where you now live, this sort of shockingly dangerous and perilous situation you'd been through. That, coupled with the fact that shortly before you embarked on this book, you got married and started a family, has that caused you to sort of reevaluate what you do for a living in that respect? I mean, or to boil it down, would you go back to a situation like Liberia if you knew it was going to be like Liberia?
One of the crucial facts about Liberia was that I had no idea what I was going into. Now I know what it was like, and I would I would still go. I would still have done it.
Would you do it now, though?
That trip?
Yeah.
I'm gonna read a little bit.
That's probably not a bad way for you to try and make up your mind.
Son of a bitch. Right. Here we go. Strangely apposite, this. Sometimes at night my daughter calls for me. Her cries of daddy rise in the short time it takes me to reach her bedroom. Her way of asking for me is half statement, as if by saying my name I must appear, and half question, the slight lift in her voice at the end questioning when, if, I will come at all. Her room is a warm, rich funk of milk and biscuits. My hand on her tangled hair guides her back to bed, collecting a film of sweat shed over her night terrors. Sometimes I think of Rocket and the other children we saw laid to waste, and of how fragile our assumptions of safety are. I decided months ago that I would not tell her about the war, about what happens in war, about what happened to me in that war and everything that came out of it, until she knows that nothing can shake the walls around us, until she is no longer a child. Once, when she was barely 2 years old, she found me crying in our living room as I struggled to swallow the stone that rises up sometimes and catches me when I least expect it. She stopped playing and put her hand on my knee. "It's okay, Daddy. Everything's okay," she told me, her eyes searching out the reason for my tears. I knew then why my grandfather, Don, had drip-fed his war to me in careful, deliberate doses. He never mentioned the screams, his screams, that tore through his sleep. He never demanded that I share the burden of his memories, not even at the end. Bella is asleep before the door closes. Outside, I listen and wait for the wet click, click, click of her dummy to stop. Her jaw slackens into silence, and I am left alone on the landing. During nights like this, I have found myself standing in the unlooked bathroom next door, chasing my reflection among the confusion of shadows thrown by the trees outside. I think of the afternoon when I undressed in front of the cracked hotel mirror in Conakry and saw for the first time the damage my body had absorbed after 2 months in the jungle with Nick. I ask who I am, who I was, what change I might be owed from all the cost of all the hubris and bloodletting that became my career. Out of the darkness I try and conjure the dreams that will not come and face the memories that will not go. Nick in his cell, me in my sanctuary. And I ask this too, who is the mercenary?
Which seems like a good prompt to ask one more question before we throw it open to the floor, which is, you describe in the book, at one point in the book, you describe the Nick, at least the Nick you spent time with in Liberia, as a version of the person I wanted to become. In what way?
Actually, that's a misquote.
Is it?
Yeah, no, but it's very close. What I said was that
Pretty sure I wrote that down right.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. He showed me a vision or a version of the person I wanted to become. In other words, he showed me not that I wanted to become him, but he'd opened a window onto a world that I could see myself in. He'd allowed me to see a kind of future for myself. He'd allowed me to see me being the person that I most wanted to be. And I think he'd done that by offering me an opportunity as a journalist and as a friend. And, you know, I think the motivations or the reasons that people go to war and the reasons that people stay at war are usually very different. And what took me to war was more born out of, a young man's desire for adventure, ego and hubris, than it was for any great notion of telling the truth. But what kept me there was a sense that with Nick, there was a real opportunity to tell stories that no one else was telling. And, you know, in amongst all of the Liberian stuff and stuff about Guinea, there was Nick was planning another operation in the Congo. We were going to jump out of, a cargo plane at 500 feet over Katanga into and I just thought, I thought of the lives of my grandfathers. Both of my grandfathers were professional soldiers. My father's father, it's from him I first heard the word mercenary. In fact, actually, he was an admirer of Mike Hoare, who he described as a wild card. It wasn't until my sort of late teens that I'd realised that mercenaries actually got paid. I thought they were volunteers, because
just because it sounded like fun.
No, because my grandfather had volunteered for Spain, then later for Biafra, and I, both of my grandparents had incredible adventures, these amazing experiences as young men, and whether they've been in the jungles of Burma or in the deserts in North Africa, these adventures have been suffused by this idea of a grand moral purpose. These were people who were engaged in fighting a war of national survival. And I felt very strongly that I wanted to do something similar, that I wanted to have these amazing adventures, but that I wanted it to have, a moral purpose to it. And after I'd been to war for the first time, I realised that staying there with Nick, that was that moral purpose. It was the ability to tell stories that no one else was telling for whatever reason. And I think that's, in large measure what sustained my ability to remain at war.
Okay, well, with that, I think, does anybody here have any questions for James? We have a microphone and everything.
James, you spoke about your time in Liberia and the fact that good people or people can do good and bad things, and that obviously happened. How did you maintain your own sense of morality when unspeakable horrors were happening? And did Nick help in that respect, in that you had somebody to answer to? And if you didn't maintain your own morality, then is that your business and his?
Yeah, I'm not sure I did maintain my own morality, to be honest with you. I think the point at which I agreed to film the coup was probably the point at which my moral compass had slid somewhat off of true north. Working in, well, conflict generally, I mean, West Africa in particular, it's like pig iron to your moral compass. It's very easy to get lost very quickly. And actually, Nick, I mean, on one occasion, I filmed one execution, and as we walked away from it, Nick looked at me and said, "You know, I just did that for the camera." And actually, I don't think he was right, but he was certainly a voice there, and not just like an imaginary voice. He was, you know, he would speak very loudly and clearly. If he thought something was not right or he had something on his mind, he'd tell you. And that was hugely important. Hugely important. He was also a fucking good shot.
A couple down the front here, I think.
Hi, I haven't read your book yet, but did Nick du Toit discuss with you who backed the coup attempt in Equatorial Guinea, and in particular, was it Severo Moto, as the Obiang regime has claimed, the exiled opposition leader in Spain?
Nick actually knew surprisingly little about the financing of the coup and who was behind it. He knew that people like Mark Thatcher, Eli Khalil, Severo Moto were involved, but he had a very sketchy idea of their exact involvement at the time. He had a much clearer idea of what equipment he was buying with the money, the relationship with the Americans, etc. And it's also, there are in fact, when we talk about the Equatorial Guinea coup, there were two simultaneous operations being planned. There was an overthrow of the government of Equatorial Guinea. There was also a seizure of power in Katanga in southern Congo. And both of these operations were to run concurrently. And at the risk of doing what all authors do, it's so bloody complicated. You just need to read how it unfolds, because the Katangan operation was the linchpin to the Equatorial Guinea operation, and the linchpin of that operation was a Congolese rebel commander who in fact was a South African spy. But yes, Severo Moto was hugely and deeply implicated in it. I mean, absolutely, completely.
Can I just ask at this point, because there is a lot in the end of the book, James does go quite in quite exhaustive detail into the backing and the financing of it. Is there anything about the whole plot that you still wish you knew?
There are a couple of things about the plot that I wish I could print.
Okay.
But this is an incredibly full and frank account of how it happened, who bankrolled it and why, and also the involvement of US intelligence agencies in it, and our own government's agency in it. And there are a couple of names that for legal reasons have been omitted, but they're not defining.
There was another question down the front here, I think. Yes.
Mine isn't directly book related, but I was thinking, what advice would you give anybody who's sort of following the same path career-wise that you have, keeping in mind that 20 years from now it may be somebody like your daughter following your footsteps? What honest advice could you give, knowing they're going to do it no matter what you say, how are you going to prepare them for it?
Very fortunately, my daughter takes mainly after my wife, which means that she's very smart. So it's not likely to happen. My advice for anyone who wants to I mean, why would you want to do this anyway? My advice for anyone who wants to do this is always the same, which is don't.
You're not good anyway.
Do something else.
Over there, I think.
Hello. I was just struck by the story of the execution done only for the camera. And I was wondering, did you feel free to speak your mind? Would you be able to tell Nick what you thought, if you thought something was wrong or not?
Yeah, I did speak my mind, very, very much so. Yeah. I mean, there was one thing that we talked about, or I talked about with him a lot, was intervention. Of the possibility of stopping these executions, it's very, I mean, it's just a very difficult area for journalists working at wars. When do you intervene and when do you not intervene? And I felt very much. There was another prisoner who was taken. I have to, you know, at this point, with the town we were in was completely besieged by government troops. And every day we survived was something like a miracle. So another government prisoner of war had been brought in and had been stripped naked and was being interrogated. And the rebels sort of didn't really know, it puts you in a very difficult position. They didn't really know what questions to ask this guy. They were asking sort of, you know, almost kind of like slapstick, kind of like German interrogation questions. Like, this isn't fucking getting us anywhere, you know. We're cut off and surrounded, and you find yourself saying, well, actually, you know what, just let me ask him a couple of questions, because I'd really like to know where the first ambush is up this road that I'm about to walk down. Thanks very much. And, you know, yes, you can untie him and everything, but actually, I mean, the lines there are so blurred. And I actually, in that one case afterwards, I spoke to Deku, the Liberian, the commander, and said, look, you know, you should let this guy go. Just let him go. If you can. And he was looking at me like I'd suggested that Martians had landed over the next ridge. It's like, you know, if you let the guy go and he goes back to government lines and can see that you treat people humanely, and if they get captured, they're not going to be executed, probably more people will surrender. I was trying him on that line, and he shot him the next morning. So that was that. I mean, I discussed it with Nick a lot of how to do that, of how, you know, could you intervene? I think one of the things about being a journalist, well, being anyone working in conflict who's not a combatant, especially journalists, the idea that you can be impartial or a neutral observer is simply a lie, and it's a very pernicious lie. And it, you know, if you're working in a frontline capacity, if you're working on a front line in an active war zone, there will come a point at which you inevitably exercise your own natural and inalienable right of self-defence. And the point at which you do that means that you automatically become a participant. And those things were, I mean, Nick and I discussed those in very great detail with each other.
They're springing up everywhere. I think you were narrowly first over this side, I think.
Is there any possibility of a glass of wine? Just
or two.
Or
indeed.
two. Red, please. That'd be lovely. Thank
Red,
you very much.
obviously. Thank you.
Can I see a starters menu as well? Right. Yes. Fire away.
Good evening. My name's Ashley. Thanks very much for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to go back to the sort of theological bit, how you view kind of good and bad deeds, as it were, and ask what you think about justice in Liberia today, and just sort of two examples maybe to focus it. Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, as you know, is the first female president in Africa, and in many ways has created a new and better Liberia. but she did support Charles Taylor financially in the late 1990s. Should she face trial or not? The rebels we saw at the beginning of the film, many of the kind of mid-ranking rebels have gone on to be senior security managers in, for example, multinational mining companies who are now operating in Liberia and are doing very well out of kind of the new Liberia.
Yeah.
So just your thoughts on that sort of, I suppose it's a sort of peace versus justice thing.
Yeah, what's your affiliation?
I work for a company called Control Risks, London.
Don't I get paid a consultancy fee to answer that? Justice in Liberia. Well, at the risk of being a bit too cute, there's a one of, let's face it, the many fantastic lines in the film Apocalypse Now. You have Captain Willard musing on the idea of murder in Vietnam. And he says, you know, accusing somebody of murder in a place like this, it's like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And I feel a little bit like that, actually. Should Taylor have gone on trial? Yes. Is it right that he accounts for his crimes? Yes. Is it right that Liberia is given absolutely the best possible chance of recovery? Yes. Does that mean that we should turn a blind eye to some things? Possibly. I mean, I think there is a greatest good for the greatest number argument to be had here. And I mean, Ellen, we'll see how history judges Ellen. She's done, on the face of it, a good job. At least it was probably the least worst job, probably a better way of putting it. She funded Charles Taylor. Great. I mean, Jesse Jackson described Charles Taylor as the new Nelson Mandela. In fact, he said that Charles Taylor's achievements put Nelson Mandela in the shade.
Which, in some senses,
is
accurate.
Which is presumably why Nelson Mandela refused to have Charles Taylor for dinner. Oh, hang on. Yeah, I mean, war crimes trials are very problematic because what they do is they put a burden of focus onto a few select individuals. And what that does is it fundamentally it allows people to be justified in their misunderstanding of the causes for the conflict. So, for example, we have this phenomenal situation in Liberia where well over 100,000 combatants were apparently disarmed by the United Nations. I mean, well over 100,000 combatants, and about 80,000 of them were child soldiers. So what this propagates is a myth that the war was fought by child soldiers, there were tens of thousands of combatants, and consequently, no wonder it took so many years to intervene, because how could you possibly stop a war being fought by that many people? Of course, it's complete bullshit. There were an absolute maximum of 3,800 rebels, probably operational 2,800. I knew the entire leadership of the rebel army, and it's very likely that the number of government troops was fractionally larger than that. And during the final stages of the war in Monrovia in 2003, in June, July 2003, there were probably 500 government troops in Monrovia. That was it. So what I'm interested in primarily is how you stop these wars from happening in the future. And it doesn't serve anyone any great benefit to indict a couple of people, lie about how many people are involved, and then pretend it's all going to be better. Because, as you rightly say, all of those mid-ranking commanders, they've still got their weapons, they've got money, and they have a following. And if anyone thinks that's not going to happen again, then they need to go back to the history books, because it will.
Yes, you have the microphone, and there's one down the front here.
I'd just like to ask a question about what your understanding is of Nick du Toit's motivation for allowing you to film the attempted coup in Equatorial Guinea. As I understand it, a certain amount of thought was given by the people involved as to how it would be perceived by the outside world, and they did talk about it there not being too many white faces sort of seen initially, because it would be perceived as a, potentially a sort of imperialist adventure. But clearly he was comfortable with the idea of you documenting it, and I'm just wondering why he was comfortable with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's fundamentally preposterous. I mean, the offer from Nick to film the coup is an absolutely perfect example of when something looks too good to be true. It's usually because it is too good to be true. And the initial conversation with Nick was, I'm going to do this, come and film it. Fantastic. To which I agreed. Why wouldn't I? Well,
would you like a list?
Dot. But I mean, in a sense, this entire book is about whether I said yes or no. I mean, it's very hard to boil this down to a couple of paragraphs. But Nick immediately followed his offer with a caveat of sorts, which was along the lines of, great, well, I've given you a great scoop for your career, and we just need a teensy-weensy little favour from you, which is that what we would really like is for this operation to look like a spontaneous local uprising and not what it was, which was the reunification of an apartheid-era special forces unit. So would it be okay if, when I filmed the arrival of the new president, Severo Moto, if I didn't get any white faces on film, and they would have the Portuguese and Spanish-speaking black troops surrounding the new president, and it would look like a spontaneous local coup d'etat. And those images would then be the only pictures that would be released in international media, and it would allow the new regime to get credibility and recognition in the region, particularly from Nigeria, or at least it would give the Nigerians a suitable excuse to recognise it. And essentially the deal was, yes, you can film your own material, you can film your own documentary, you can do all of that, but in the very first place we need you to essentially shoot propaganda for us. And that was the crux of the offer.
There's a question down here.
I wanted to ask, how much can one trust a mercenary to save one's life, and how much one can trust a journalist to tell the truth?
Well, of all of the reasons that people do things, if there are any grandmothers in the audience, I apologise for I'm about to teach you how to suck eggs, but I feel that of all the reasons that people do things, money is often the purest. And I'd much rather be protected by someone who is being a paid professional to do the job.
Somebody pays more.
Well, that's why we don't have a functioning civil service, I suppose. Because they all work for control risks. I haven't met very many or even any soldiers who aren't paid by someone. So word mercenary is a little bit of a tricky term, really. Nick hates it, hates the term mercenary. Cobus quite enjoyed it. It's a difficult one. A lot of it comes down to an individual personal relationship. And the fact of the matter was, when I couldn't pay Nick and didn't have the money to pay him, he still did his job. Can you trust a journalist to tell the truth? Well, I think going back to the theological argument, as someone else once said, what is truth?
So is this book the truth?
Absolutely.
I think it's always worth bearing in mind when discussing the nature of truth that the entirety of Judeo-Christian civilization is founded on the testimony of fishermen. You, sir.
James, Nick was probably not your executive producer on this film. He was probably your production manager, I would think. So you were putting a lot of trust in your production manager rather than your executive producer. Did you know who the executive producer was? And also, when you weren't available, did someone take your place for this project? Do you know what I mean? Obviously, you're putting trust in Nick, but I doubt it was Nick's idea to have you along to film it. Or was it? Or was somebody, was he asked to procure a cameraman, a filmmaker, to come along and make the film?
Well, in fact, actually, it's kind of a sort of a weird development, this, but Nick, we hatched this together. I mean, he'd been told about 10 days previously. We were sitting in the bar and he said, hey, look, you'll never guess what I've been asked to do. Would you like to come along and film it? And then when he went back to South Africa, he saw Simon Mann and said, oh, you know, I've got this great friend, James, who's a documentary filmmaker and a journalist, and I've asked him to film the coup. What a great idea. Simon took a little bit of convincing that was a good idea, but it was very much sort of Nick had cooked it up and then presented the plan to Simon. They talked a lot about it together, and Simon agreed that I should be kept in the loop about it. I was then introduced to Simon, we met, we stayed in contact by telephone and email. So what Nick didn't realise was that the organisers and financiers of the coup were very worried about Nick's motivations. They thought that after a successful coup, Nick would then stage a counter coup and would take power himself for his own people. So there were actually plans in writing to essentially stage a sort of putsch afterwards and purge the mercenaries of his men and influence. So
it's quite a bag of bagels.
It certainly is, yeah.
Barrel of monkeys is possibly a more apposite. Does anybody else have a question? Yes, over here.
How did those responsible for Equatorial Guinea actually think they were going to carry this off, given the history of rather spectacular failure in similar escapades in the past?
So I don't understand the question. How did they
think they were going to pull this off?
The people in charge of the coup?
Yeah.
Well, I think crucially, they hadn't really thought about it. That's a main thing. There's an enormous difference, as you know, between being able to stage a successful military operation, kill or capture the president, and then what happens afterwards. And I think that, militarily speaking, it was plausible that they could have ousted Obiang. But the operation that was launched at the end was, frankly, beyond the pale because of its infiltration by the security services of lots of different places. There were two attempts at launching the coup. There was one in February 2004, then they were closely followed by one in early March 2004. And had the early February event occurred, they almost certainly would have deployed successfully in Malabo. Of course, it couldn't have worked because the linchpin was a South African NIA agent who was, controlling the Congolese airfields. But what would have happened subsequent to that? I was sort of always slightly confused by this. I had a long conversation with Billy Mercenaries, who was then Mbeki's security advisor, who's sort of South Africa's chief spook, if you like, at the time. And I said to him, but you know, surely this is all bonkers, because if Severo had been put in power, I mean, would Nigeria have recognised him? Would South Africa have recognised him? And his answer was emphatically yes, they would have done. And I think I think the real enduring question is whether or not Severo would have outplayed Simon Mann and his political advisors, whether or not he would have used them to be installed and then booted them out. And I think the answer to that is almost definitely. I mean, what the coup plotters planned was not simply a mercenary-led seizure of power. They wanted to contractually own and control the nation-state of Equatorial Guinea in a way that hasn't happened since, you know, I mean, the East India Company governed India. I mean, it was just barking mad. You know, and the Nigerians at some point would have just said, you know what, thanks very much, see you later, and that would have been it.
Okay, we've got time for 2 more questions, I think. So there's one there and then one up the back, and sorry for making you run around, Millie.
Yes, it sounds like you witnessed some atrocious acts. Did you find your own moral sensibilities getting dulled as the weeks and months went by, or was each execution as shocking as the first?
I think there is a degree of habituation to violence, certainly. I personally find actual violence a lot easier to witness than screen violence, than fictional violence. I mean, I walked out of Gladiator, couldn't stomach it. But I find sort of actual violent acts being perpetrated. I mean, they don't make me throw up. I don't, you know, don't have those reactions to dead bodies or the consumption thereof. I mean, it's certainly had very profound and lasting psychological ramifications, and you know, one of the very, very difficult things about filming, specifically filming, not just witnessing, but filming acts of violence, is that you are engaged necessarily in an aesthetic act. And the truth of the matter is that, you know, when I filmed someone being beheaded, and it's actually quite hard work taking someone's head off with an AK bayonet. It takes a long time. And it gives you plenty of time to frame the shot properly. And it was an end of an evening, there'd been a bit of monsoon rain, nice, it was a golden hour, really. And I found myself shuffling a couple of feet to the left and just touching the zoom a little bit to bring the head into the upper right third of the frame. And the point at which you are composing murder is a point at which you're so lost, and it's very hard to find your way back again. I was genuinely pleased that that man was being murdered in front of me so I could film it. I wasn't glad he died, wasn't glad he'd been killed, but if he was going to be killed, I was very happy that it happened in front of me. And that's, as a human being, is a very unpleasant place to be.
And there was one more up the back, I think.
So it's just 2 very short parts. You said that Nick was released halfway through your writing the book. Presumably you showed him the book. Did he ask you to change it? Did he ask you to do anything with it? Was he happy? And secondly, how is your relationship with Nick today, given that you missed this particular show and he left to live through it?
Oh, well, it's a brilliant question to end on.
It is.
It is. My relationship with Nick today is extremely good. I was waiting at home for him when he was released. And I sort of thought at first, you know, I don't know if he's going to want to talk about this. I have no idea, you know. I mean, Nick physically carried me through bits of the jungle. He was a wiry, strong guy, you know. And when he was released from jail, he looked like what he was, which was a prison camp survivor. And he'd lost 40% of his body weight. I put my arms around him, and I could feel his ribs through his back. And within 10 minutes, all his family was there, and me, you know, everyone babbling away in Afrikaans. And within a quarter of an hour, he and I were sitting at one sort of corner of their backyard, talking about what had happened to General Deku. He was sort of reminiscing about when he'd gone through selection for the recce's. And we sat and we talked for, I think it was 18 hours. We just didn't stop. And it went on like that, day after day after day. And then, we're in communication. We don't speak to each other every day at the moment, but we're in contact extremely regularly. And I finished writing the book and I showed it to him, and I was just, as a last reading, and I think we should give the last words to Nick, frankly. On first reading the book, he wrote this by return. James, I read the draft. Not too bad. You never shared your inner feelings and doubts with me, but it's good you do bring it out in the book. It makes me look like an asshole at times, but the epilogue does put things a little back into perspective. Thanks also for your loyalty to me. In the end, what matters is our friendship, which nobody can take away from us, and I'm sure that you trust me enough to go with me again. Not that I'm planning anything like that.
Okay, well, on that, thank you all very much for coming. There are copies of James's absolutely excellent book for sale over there at what I'm sure is a reasonable price.
And also, we are extremely fortunate that as well as purchasing this overly large doorstop, you can buy a proper book, and in fact 2 proper books.
Yes, I have an extremely limited number of copies of both of my own. For what are you selling yours for? Just out of interest.
£1 less than yours. It falls into the category. Make him laugh, make him cry.
James's is $12.99. Mine are only a tenner each. Just, you know, putting that out there.
It's good night. Well, Liberia, an Uncivil War, which is the feature-length documentary I made, is apparently available on Amazon. There we are. It's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. James Brabazon, thank you very much.